For over 1,000 years, Windsor Castle has stood as a symbol of royal power, tradition, and resilience. It has been a military fortress, a stately palace, and a private sanctuary of kings and queens. But it seems that not all of them have left. From a limping Henry VIII to a tormented Charles I, the ghosts of some of Britain's most iconic monarchs are said to still walk these halls, long after they've passed away. Some sightings are centuries old, others surprisingly recent, with quiet rumours that perhaps even our late Queen Elizabeth II may have already returned to her beloved home. Visitors, guards, palace staff, and even the royal family themselves have all experienced paranormal activity within the walls of the castle, hearing disembodied footsteps, feeling cold spots, and even capturing images of things they can't explain. And so, is Windsor Castle still home to the monarchy, in more ways than one? So we're talking about a castle in Britain, so of course our story starts with our old pal, a regular feature on the channel. Give it up for William the Conqueror. After his success at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and as part of his establishing that, no, really, the Normans are here to stay and you need to get okay with it, he chose to build what would become Windsor Castle on a site near the River Thames and right on the edge of a Saxon hunting ground. Near the river was obviously a great place strategically, and being next to a hunting ground, well, that just meant that King William had a bit of sport on his doorstep anytime he felt like stepping out. And this castle was built as part of a ring of other castles that encircled London, which would help to squash any rebellions from rising in the city, as military forces could get into the city from all sides quickly. And then Windsor Castle was also in the perfect spot to protect London from outside attack from the west too. In 1070, construction started on the wooden Motte and Bailey design, so the Motte, that's basically a big old mound of earth which has the keep on the top of it. And then the Bailey is a walled-in courtyard, so it's a great, effective structure for defence, and it's relatively easy to build as well. In Windsor Castle, it had two of them, two Baileys, an upper ward on the east and a lower ward on the west of the Motte. Just because the site was big enough, so why not? May as well defend more of it. And 16 years after construction began, Windsor Castle was finally complete in 1086. But as we are about to find out, Windsor Castle was not going to stay in its original design for long. This place has been a labour of love for so many different people over the centuries. By 1110, King Henry I had added domestic quarters for him within the castle, and had actually been the first monarch to actually use it as a royal residence. And then his grandson, King Henry II, he set about converting the place into a proper palace fit for a king. The original timber structures were, over time, replaced with stone, with the old square Norman keep sat on top of the Motte replaced with the stone round tower around 1170-ish. He reinforced the walls, added new towers, all that sort of thing. And while these improvements were obviously to display the status and defensiveness of the castle, the work was actually pretty necessary anyway, as they did have trouble with subsidence, especially around the Motte. After that, other improvements and changes were made just here and there, until in the 13th century, and King Henry III really went for it. He completely rebuilt Henry II's additions to the lower ward. He constructed a huge chapel, like all of these sorts of things. But in 1296, the lower ward was damaged by a fire that broke out, which completely destroyed the Great Hall, and it wasn't actually rebuilt afterwards. But there was plenty more DIY SOS in store for the castle, especially once King Edward III took to the throne in 1327. He had a huge vision for the place. He wanted this great big hulking palace where he could both conduct his official kingly business as well as have a private residence, all on the same site, just very convenient. And so in the 1350s, he enlisted the help of William of Wykeham, who would go on to oversee a lot of the works to the castle. And King Edward, he was willing to throw a bunch of money at this project that he had in mind. It was ambitious and obviously needed a lot of manpower to complete it in a reasonable length of time. Problem was, around this time that the project was about to get going, it was a pretty significant time in the country's history, as they were still attempting to recover from the mass death caused by the bubonic plague. And so sheriffs were sent out to round up any and all masons and carpenters who were up to the task, so that they could be brought back to work on Windsor Castle. Even with all of that though, the work took decades and cost over £50,000, which would have been about £48.6 million in today's money. It was actually the most expensive secular building project in England during the Middle Ages. He didn't do things by halves. But King Edward, he didn't get to enjoy the finished product as he died in 1377, 6 years before the project was complete. But once it was done, it was this incredible Gothic-style royal palace. But they still weren't done there. Oh, no. King Edward IV, he started building the present St. George's Chapel in 1475, which would become a very important, obviously, resting place for both him and many other kings and queens after him. Moving on into the time of the Tudors, not a million things happened to the castle. The monarchs who had come before them had already done a bang-up job of turning Windsor into a proper royal palace. King Henry VII did update the royal apartments, and his son, King Henry VIII, he had the gate at the bottom of the lower ward built, as well as a timber terrace along the north side of the upper ward, so he could take a stroll and watch any hunting going on in the park. Because that was the thing about this time, they didn't really feel the need to do huge amounts to the castle, really. It already looked the part. It was relatively structurally sound for now. It was more just about putting their own stamp on the place more than anything, if they felt so inclined. But by the time Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne, that attitude had come at a cost, with a lot of the castle desperately needing some TLC. She could see Windsor Castle for what it was, though. It was still a secure fortress, which would be invaluable during times of crisis. She knew it could stand a siege if need be. And so, with that in mind, she invested in the repair and the upkeep of the place throughout the 1570s, much more than any of her other palaces. She also had a long gallery built that overlooked the North Terrace, which eventually became part of the Royal Library. And I'm telling you that specific bit for a reason that will become clearer later on. Windsor Castle looked set to have another round of improvements, as in 1629, King Charles I had the place surveyed, ready to come up with a plan, something which would never come to fruition, as the English Civil War was just around the corner when Parliament went to war against the King. And Windsor Castle was actually taken by parliamentary forces in 1642, and it stayed as a Roundhead stronghold for the rest of the war, being used as a garrison for the soldiers, as well as a prison to detain captured royalists. But being as it was a symbol of the monarchy, full to the brim of the pomp and pageantry that came along with it, including, of course, more treasures than you can shake a stick at, the castle suffered for it. Valuables from St. George's Chapel were broken and stolen, stained glass windows were smashed, books were defaced. Out in the Great Park, the deer were hunted relentlessly, fences were broken up for firewood for the soldiers, all of this. King Charles was actually imprisoned at Windsor Castle at the end of the war, and once he'd been executed on the 30th of January 1649, his body was brought back to the castle to be buried in St. George's Chapel. During the time of the Commonwealth, so after King Charles I had lost his head and Parliament was running the show, the castle again fell into disrepair. Squatters had moved into the place, anything remotely of value was nicked, and by 1660 it was said that the royal apartments, once home to royalty, were a complete wreck. But when the king's son, King Charles II, came to the throne, he turned it all around and restored the castle to bring it back to its former glory, remodelling the interiors into what was said to be one of the most extravagantly baroque interiors ever executed in England. And I really hope that that wasn't a word-for-word compliment that someone gave to the king at the time. Just a bad choice of words considering what happened to his dad. Moving forward in time again though, King George I and King George II didn't really seem particularly fussed about Windsor. They didn't spend a huge amount of time here, and so they didn't expend any effort and resources on it. And so, as it wasn't particularly crucial as a royal residence, around the 1750s, Windsor Castle started popping up in guidebooks. And us, members of the great unwashed, the public, commoners like me and you could go and traipse around the palace. And if you threw a bit of coin to the castle keeper, he would show you the mythical unicorn horn that was in the royal collections, conveniently leaving out the part that it is actually a narwhal horn instead. When King George III came to the throne though, Windsor Castle returned back to its old life and became the royal family's main country home. And because of that, you can't just let the riffraff loose around your castle, and so it was used as more of a private space again. But King George, he absolutely loved Windsor Castle and the parkland around it, much preferring it to Hampton Court. That palace just felt a bit too formal. And so just like so many monarchs before him, King George III did a bunch of work to Windsor Castle, redoing some of King Charles II's apartments, replacing the staircase, redoing the exterior of the castle into that Gothic revival style palace again. Unfortunately though, the castle that he loved so much would eventually kind of become a gilded cage for him, when his mental health declined so badly that he had to be kept in isolation from 1810 onwards. He was already pretty much blind at that point with cataracts, and the death of his youngest and favourite daughter, Princess Amelia, who who died aged 27, just triggered this rapid decline into severe mental illness. And I had heard about the Mad King before now. I knew that basically we'd had a king whose mental health had declined so badly that he was confined to Windsor Castle, but reading about it to put this story together, it just sounds so sad and really hits a little bit close to home. When his wife, Queen Charlotte, died in 1818, her coffin was brought to Windsor, and palace staff actually lined the courtyard with straw so the funeral procession wouldn't make a sound. They didn't want him seeing, and it setting him off, knowing how badly Princess Amelia's death had affected him. But he'd spend almost a decade there alone, where he'd hallucinate, holding imaginary conversations with his dead children, or he would just cry and cry and cry for hours on end. He passed away in 1820, and by that point he was completely blind, almost entirely deaf. He developed dementia and had no understanding of him being king or anything like that. His son had long already taken over ruling the country as Prince Regent by that point anyway, but for the last few weeks of his life, he couldn't even walk. And so, once his father had died and George IV took the throne as king, he carried on that labour of love for Windsor Castle that his dad had shown before his mental illness had taken over. But where George III had restored the castle in a more subtle, quiet affection, more sort of admiration for the place, George IV went all out. Under his rule, they raised the height of the round tower, redid a bunch of masonry around the exterior, and added more towers and battlements. They wanted to bring Windsor Castle back to being that imposing icon of the monarchy, standing out as a gem fit for the grandeur of the crown. By that point, the symbolic and ceremonial head of the British Empire. And by the time the work was complete, King George IV had spent about £300,000 on the work, about 30 million in today's money. He passed away at Windsor Castle on the 26th of June 1830 in the Blue Room, which will eventually become a theme as King William IV, he also died in the Blue Room in 1837. When Queen Victoria came to the throne, thanks to her uncle George, she hadn't needed to do too much to the place. But that didn't stop her from making tweaks here and there, as she had apparently complained that the castle was dreadfully gloomy, even comparing it to a prison. And you know Victorian prisons at the time, not the nicest place to find yourself in. But she did warm to the place, spending Christmases there and all of that. And she did actually have a private chapel created in the eastern end of the state apartments. It was also at this point that running water and drainage were added to the castle, although she wasn't a fan of this newfangled gas lighting. Don't like it, don't want it, it's just a fad, it will never catch on. Give me a bajillion candles over that any day. And so the castle stayed pretty cold and dimly lit throughout her reign, even though she had been the one complaining about the castle being dreadfully gloomy. There was a fire in 1853 though, which destroyed a load of apartments and the state dining room, but they were able to get the fire under control and from there they could rebuild. In 1861 though, Prince Albert died of typhoid fever, not before asking to be moved to the Blue Room so he could pass away there. Whether it was because of the natural light coming in through the big tall windows of the room, or whether it was because both King George IV and King William IV had both died in that room before him, or maybe it was a little bit of both, I don't judge. After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria was famously heartbroken. She wore black mourning dresses for the rest of her life, actually earning herself the nickname the Widow of Windsor. She even had the Blue Room, Albert's room, preserved, just the way it was when he died, and it became almost sort of like a shrine to her late husband. Fresh flowers were displayed in the room, hot water was put in the wash basin, clothes were laid out for him, as if he could just walk back into the room at any moment. And the Queen would visit the room often to pray, to reflect, to feel that little bit closer to him. And it's also no secret that Queen Victoria was an enthusiastic participant in seances. She'd attended them with Prince Albert when he was alive, and so after his death, she did the same, trying to contact him. She allegedly did conduct seances at Windsor Castle and actually kept notes, but the story goes that these notes were burned after her death by the Dean of Windsor, who didn't want a whole royal scandal about the late Queen trying to chat to ghosts in her spare time. Her son, Edward VII, when he became king, he decided that the mourning period after losing his father had gone on long enough, and Windsor Castle needed some new life breathing into it. He cleared out rooms of their furniture, some that hadn't been touched since Prince Albert had died, and sent a bunch of Queen Victoria's prized knickknacks into storage. They weren't his style. He was also the one to drag the castle into the modern age, installing electric lighting, central heating, telephone lines, all sorts of good stuff. So again, when his son, the next monarch, came along, King George V, and his wife Queen Mary, they didn't have a great deal to do to it. Windsor Castle seems to have evolved in kind of like a staircase pattern-ish. Someone will make a bunch of changes, really do it up, and then the next person won't really need to, it'll stay quite steady, little renovation here and there, but then the next person, or a few people down the line, they'll pour a bucket load of money into it and bring it up to their modern standards, and so on it goes over the centuries. Does that make sense? But during the time of King George V, that's when the royal family changed their surname from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a very German-sounding name for, admittedly, a German family, to Windsor, named after the castle. And this was because in 1917 it was right in the thick of World War I, and so there was strong anti-German sentiment from the country at the time. Not a great time to be reminded that your royal family literally came over from Germany to be head of state. When it was time for his son, Edward VIII, to step up, he infamously abdicated the throne in 1936 so that he could marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, which at the time was a royal scandal of the highest order. He'd only been king for less than a year, hadn't even had a coronation yet, and preferred to live at Fort Belvedere anyway, a house on the Windsor estate, rather than any of the other palaces. So he didn't really have a great deal to do with Windsor Castle or any of the changes made. He did broadcast his abdication speech from Windsor Castle though, and after he left the country, he became the Duke of Windsor. His brother, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, they had a lot of love for Windsor Castle though. And when World War II broke out, it was all the more important for them, as that's where Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret spent the majority of their time to keep them both safe from the bombs in London. It was also where valuables like the crown jewels were stored during the Blitz, in case the Tower of London suffered a hit. By later on in the 20th century though, when Queen Elizabeth II was on the throne, parts of Windsor Castle, especially places like the state apartments, they were starting to give away their age. They were just a little bit past their best, in need of modernisation. And so in the 1980s, a big refurbishment programme was started, which took care of things like updated heating and wiring, but also some structural stuff too. The mound on which the round tower sat, that was starting to subside again, all those centuries later. But it would all be nothing in comparison to the repair work needed after a devastating fire at Windsor Castle on the 20th of November 1992, which was also Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip's wedding anniversary. A faulty spotlight in Queen Victoria's private chapel caused the curtain near it to catch fire, and within minutes it had engulfed the area in flames. The fire was first spotted at about 11:30 in the morning, and over the next 15 hours, 225 firefighters from 7 different counties had attended to fight the flames, and they were finally extinguished at 2:30 in the morning of the 21st of November. The private chapel was obviously gutted, with extensive damage to St George's Hall and a bunch of other rooms, the state dining room that had been rebuilt after the 1853 fire. In total, it was something like 115 rooms that needed repair after this fire. By some small miracle, they only lost 2 works of art though, as most other things had actually been removed from the area of the castle because they were doing some rewiring work. 5 years to the day after the fire, the restoration works had been complete though, and they'd made some interesting discoveries along the way too. In the great kitchen, the plastered wood ceiling had to be removed completely, revealing the timbers above it. These timbers had been dated, and they were over 650 years old, dating back to the time of King Edward III in the 14th century. It's wild to think that they had been up there that entire time. But that, my friends, is as concise as I can make the history of Windsor Castle, because now we have come up to the 21st century, where the castle and its grounds continue to be a royal residence, a visitor attraction, and even home to still hundreds of people, from royal household staff to the military knights of Windsor, basically retired army officers who serve in kind of like ceremonial roles. And King Charles III, he's doing his bit to put his own stamp on the place too, redoing his mum's private apartments, putting some of her stuff into storage, things like that. But he's also doing bits like installing electric car chargers and planting a bunch of trees too. But there we go, Windsor Castle, almost 1,000 years of history, and throughout all of that time being a significant place for the royal family. Countless royal births and deaths, and then obviously burials as well, within its walls. And so that's probably why so many kings and queens of time gone by have been spotted here long after their deaths, right? Spanning all the way back to the big man himself, King Henry VIII, as he's been been seen prowling the castle. Prowling might be the wrong choice of words, actually. Both visitors and staff have apparently witnessed the recognisable figure of the Tudor king. When he appears, he's said to look absolutely furious, and he's seen barking orders at servants that aren't there. He's been seen most often in the upper ward near the deanery, which is the home of the Dean of Windsor, the person who looks after St George's Chapel. But in 1977, two soldiers who were stationed out on one of the terraces, I don't know specifically where, but they said that they saw the figure of King Henry VIII. And he wasn't furious this time, he actually just strolled past them, hands clasped behind his back, which is a very kingly way to walk. I imagine in his prime it is probably how he walked. You know, that sort of swagger that only comes from being the big boss in charge. Before the figure of the king then turned and walked into a solid wall. Well, apparently, looking at old plans of the castle, a doorway had once used to be there during the time of Henry's reign. But then sometimes he's not seen, but rather heard. And it's thought to be him because the sound is quite distinctive. You'll hear loud thumping footsteps, which sound like they're limping heavily, almost dragging one leg behind, all accompanied by the groaning sounds of pain. And knowing that Henry VIII suffered from debilitating leg ulcers in his later years, this limping is then obviously attributed to him. And as if practically crawling your way around one of your castles in death wasn't bad enough, it seems like he shares the space with one of the wives that he did oh so dirty, Queen Anne Boleyn herself. She is a bit of a rock star in the paranormal world, thought to be haunting a range of different places: the Tower of London, Blickling Hall, Hever Castle, like so many different spots. But she has also apparently been seen here at Windsor Castle too. She has sometimes been seen wandering the grounds of the castle as a headless figure, but most of the time she appears whole, and she seems to most often manifest in a window in the Dean's cloister, looking really mournful, sometimes seen actually weeping, just very clearly not happy at all. And it's interesting that she would be seen at Windsor Castle at all, as yeah, she would have visited the castle when she was alive. She was granted the title of Marquess of Pembroke here in 1532, but it never really played a super significant role in her life, really. So maybe she's just following around her husband, tormenting him for what he did to her. We can only hope. It seems fair, to be honest. Or maybe it's because Windsor Castle is a place where her beloved daughter, good Queen Bess, Queen Elizabeth I, also seems to be haunting. And her ghost story in this castle, it is pretty famous. We have chatted about her before in the episode about the royal family themselves witnessing ghosts, because Queen Elizabeth I has been commonly spotted walking through the royal library, a place that's completely closed off to the public. Only the royals and staff have access to it. People who have witnessed her include Empress Frederick, who was Queen Victoria's eldest kid. King Edward VII, he mentioned to mistresses about seeing her. King George VI saw her before the outbreak of World War II. And apparently Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Princess Margaret also had an encounter with her. It is also said that King George III had a chat with a mysterious lady in the royal library who mentioned that she was married to England, which sounds convincing. You know, Queen Elizabeth didn't marry her entire life. She was very dedicated to her job. She was even known to have said words to that effect anyway. But I don't know when this encounter supposedly happened. It would be an important detail to know whether it was before 1810 or afterwards when he was confined there because of his mental illness, you know? But the story always seems to be relatively similar for each encounter. Witnesses will describe hearing what sounds like high-heeled footsteps on the wooden floor, getting gradually louder as she approaches. When she comes into view, she's said to be a tall woman wearing a black dress with black lace covering her head. She has also appeared to non-royals too, though, as a guards officer called Lieutenant Carglin found out on one afternoon in February 1897. He was sat in the Royal Library reading when he heard those high-heeled footsteps approaching. And what stuck out to him was that these were the footsteps of a woman who knew where she was going. They were purposeful. She was striding to wherever she was going. When she came into view, she walked straight past him wearing the black dress and lace thing over her head. And the lieutenant was shocked because she looked exactly like the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I that he'd seen. There was no mistaking her. But even so, could still be a massive coincidence, right? Yeah, until he realised that the direction that she had just walked in was a dead end and he couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. He went and had a look and sure enough, she had gone. There wasn't anyone about. Okay, that's not supposed to happen. He went and mentioned it to an attendant who was close by, asking who the woman in the black dress was, who definitely would have walked past them in order to get to the Royal Library. To which the attendant responded saying that the lieutenant was the only person who had even been in the library that afternoon. The one and only Peter Underwood, the paranormal investigator and author, he looked into this particular story and apparently found that there would have been seen a flight of steps leading down from that room that Lieutenant Carglin saw the apparition walk into. And in Queen Elizabeth's day, she would have walked out that way onto the terrace below. But she's not the only monarch seen around the royal library. King Charles I has apparently been spotted leaning on the back of a chair in this area, looking very sombre, very deep in some serious thought, stroking his little beard. He's also been seen around the cannon's house too, and while he was executed by beheading, similarly to Anne Boleyn, he appears with his head and body intact. And so with being imprisoned at the castle before his execution, a most likely extremely stressful time for the guy, and then also being brought back to St. George's Chapel for a quick and dirty burial, it does seem to make sense that he would still be hanging around here. There was also a story about when his coffin was brought back to be buried. The black drape that was covering it turned white from the snow that had been falling, and a lot of people took that to be a supernatural message that the king had been innocent. But there could also be another reason that he has been seen around Windsor Castle, because rather than being left to rest in peace, his body was apparently poked around a bit with in the 19th century by the then Prince Regent George, who would eventually go on to be George IV. A physician called Sir Henry Halford, who was also present, made a note of the 1813 exhumation, when he was found in his lead coffin in the vault alongside King Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. They opened this coffin that had the name and the year of his death written on it, and looked at the remains of this long dead king, and noted that, yeah, the shape of his face, the beard, and the hair still attached, they all resemble King Charles I. But what really gave it away, obviously, was the clean cut at his neck that looked to have been made with a heavy, sharp implement, a bit like an axe. However, that's not all that went down at that exhumation in 1813. Because whether he did it with the permission of the Prince Regent and it was all okayed, or he did it on the sly, Sir Henry Halford took a few souvenirs from the coffin. Not like a handkerchief or a scrap of clothing or anything like that, which, even if it was, still macabre, but okay. No, he took a portion of his beard, a tooth, and his fourth vertebra, the one that showed the marks from the executioner's axe. So that could definitely be enough to rile up a ghost, I'd say. Yeah, you may have permission from the future King of England, but what about the king you just took it from? But aside from Charlie, there's another monarch still said to be haunting Windsor Castle. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as he spent a reasonable portion of his life here before he passed away, King George III. And again, he's been encountered in the Royal Library. That really seems to be a bit of a hotspot. The word "what?" repeated 3 times in a very confused tone is sometimes heard in the area and is thought to be George III, as apparently that was one of the things he would often say when he was going through periods of confusion. Not long after he died, the king that they once called mad, although we now know was just seriously ill, was involved in another particularly famous ghost story about the castle. As the soldiers stationed at Windsor Castle were doing their daily drills in the quadrangle on one mid-February morning in 1820, the guard commander looked up at the king's window and saw that he was there, watching them, which he did often, wasn't out of the ordinary. As is the protocol in that situation, the guard commander gave the order, "Eyes right," basically a marching salute, and in response, King George gave a salute back to them. The problem was, this was the 15th, maybe 16th of February 1820. King George had been dead since the 29th of January. His body was, at that very moment that those soldiers were saluting him, lying in state inside the royal apartments. Yet there he was, standing in the window like he had so many times before, and just as clearly seen by the guard commander and the soldiers below, all of whom were returning the salute to their late king. And apparently after this, George III would be seen in the window again and again, so much so that some soldiers started to dread doing their patrol around the upper ward. They'd see the curtain twitch in the late king's apartment window, a pale hand would peel back the curtain, and there he'd be, saluting the soldiers walking past, before the curtain fell back into place. It does make me think, with his altered mental state towards the end, you quite often find that people will slip back into ingrained patterns of behaviour, just kind of running on autopilot kind of thing. So could that continue after death? If your consciousness or your soul or energy or whatever it is cannot grasp the concept of death, and so then you just continue to do the things that you did in life? It makes you wonder whether something like that happened to King George III, and him being witnessed in the window was just something that his consciousness hung on to after death. One thing to add to that sighting of King George III, though, is that as far as I could tell, the accounts of seeing him at the window stopped around the time that his son and successor, King George IV, passed away in 1830. Unless you've got a more recent account, in which case please do let me know, but otherwise I thought that was a really interesting detail. Almost like his son's death was the point where he realised he didn't need to keep watch over the drills or anything. Now you can rest, but maybe he's still about in some other form though, as castle staff have often commented that the particular area where King George would have looked out onto the quadrangle, it does feel like it has a kindly energy to it, a gentle, peaceful presence. Which I think personally, I want to believe that part. It gives me some hope that the king has found some peace in death. Dementia is a thing that runs in my family, and I have seen what it can do. I've had multiple grandparents diagnosed with it, and the distress that it causes, obviously to the family members around it, but also the person suffering from it, it's incomprehensible. Any degenerative disease which alters your mental state, like what King George III went through, I can only imagine trying to live through that as torture. Being confused and trapped inside your own head that doesn't even make sense to you anymore. Just how frightening that must feel. And so it kind of gives me solace that people have felt peace around an area where George has been witnessed. So I'm just gonna live in my comfy little reality where I believe that to be the case. You may have a different take on it depending on your own beliefs, and honestly, that is totally okay. But I've still got more royal ghosts to tell you about who are said to be haunting Windsor Castle. It is a busy place for the paranormal. We need to chat about the ghost of Queen Victoria first, who I did mention in my first episode about the royal family, as she allegedly had a run-in with some labourers who, under the instruction of King Edward VIII, were trying to rip up some trees that Victoria and Albert had planted. And if the story is to be believed, she basically ran them off the grounds, the trees never got removed, and that was that. But she apparently has also been seen haunting the private apartments and the castle grounds. And witnesses who have seen her, I don't think we've got specific accounts or anything, but they say that she appears wearing her iconic mourning dress, something she would have worn after her husband, Prince Albert, died. And while King George's ghost story gives me a bit of comfort, this one just makes me a little bit sad. Like, why is she still wearing the mourning dresses? Was it because that was just the state she died in? But why, if George's presence feels at peace now, why can't she be reunited with Prince Albert? I don't know, I might be reading a bit too much into it there, getting a bit too philosophical when I sat down to write out the research for this one, clearly. It may just be that it's a residual echo, playing back a moment in time from her life post-Albert, and it's not actually her presence per se. But then again, it's interesting that she's said to most often appear when major work is being done to the castle, major renovations and restorations, almost as if she's returning and checking over everything. Clearly something that she needs to do. Goodness knows what would have happened if those spruce trees had been ripped up. Where would it have ended if she hadn't intervened from beyond the grave? Doesn't bear thinking about. But there's one more queen I need to tell you about, supposedly haunting Windsor Castle, because perhaps our most recent one is still wandering the halls of the royal home that she loved so much in life. Because Queen Elizabeth II, she absolutely adored Windsor. In her last few years, she spent a huge portion of her time there, barring obviously Balmoral, another favourite of hers, which was actually where she passed away in 2022. But when one fan of the royal family was taking a tour around Windsor Castle, they captured what they believed to be images of the late Queen. And the shots are blurry, but I can kind of see where they're coming from. When she'd be out on state visits, she'd be in the very coordinated outfit, complete with the hat and the handbag, and if you squint, yeah, you can kind of see how that would resemble. The person who took the photos wanted to stay anonymous. They claim that they're pretty skeptical of the paranormal, but they can't explain these strange blurs on the images. The way they take two photos and the blur has moved. Lens flare? Trick of the light? Some castle staff member moving really fast past the camera? I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to decide, but based on the number of stories about other royals allegedly haunting Windsor Castle, I can believe that she would return back here like monarchs who have come before her. Because while kings and queens passed through the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, leaving their own mark, their own stamp on the place during their lifetime, if the ghost stories are to be believed, it does seem like some royals leave more of themselves than others. But I want to hear your thoughts. Is Windsor Castle haunted by kings and queens? Which ones do you think are still lingering there, if any? And if you visited the castle, maybe even worked there and had an experience of your own, I would absolutely love to hear all about it. Please do share in the comments. I think after being such an important part of the monarchy for getting close to 1,000 years, it's inevitable that a king or two end up haunting the place. Whether it is actually them or just a residual echo of a moment in their life at the castle. But let me know what you think, and before you start screaming at your screens saying that I've missed out on a bunch of other Windsor Castle ghosts, including what is possibly one of the most famous phantoms said to be haunting the area, don't you worry, don't you fret. There were so many ghost stories to Windsor Castle that I have had to, yet again, split this episode into 2 parts. So today we've been all through the history and the royal ghosts at the castle, but next week we're going to be covering everyone else who is supposedly haunting the place. Because there were a lot. From 14th century architects, to soldiers, to castle staff, to what could possibly be an ancient Celtic god. Always going to be an interesting one, so if you want to hear all about it, make sure you're subscribed because, I don't know, I'd quite like to see you again if you fancy it. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get yourself a drink of water, stay hydrated, I don't want you ending up as a ghost. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre, so until next time, sleep safe. So I've had a little bit of a jig around with a new back table and things like that, and I just couldn't bear to close the door on this face. I don't even know if you're going to be able to see him. Say hi! I know, the cats usually sit there, don't they? Yeah. So Ernie may be making an appearance in videos. What you doing? You having a good time? Are you a good boy? Yeah.